Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today again is my good friend Drewish for part 2 of his excellent series on practical epistemology. You can find episode 1 in the announcements channel or in RT Podcasts. I highly recommend it. And today Drewish is also going to give us a little bit of a reading from his upcoming new book, which we're really looking forward to. So before we get started, please make sure you join the Roundtable Discord server. Keep an eye on announcements channel. We do podcasts every day, usually at 9 Central. And make sure you've liked, followed, and subscribed to our YouTube video, BitChute, and SoundCloud accounts, all on the RT Podcast channel. But that being said, welcome, Drewish. Thank you for joining me. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Been a busy week, but I get more accomplished when I'm busy.
Absolutely, that's great. So as we discussed last time, right, epistemology is sort of the science or the study of how we know what we know, how to go about having a solid approach to knowledge and understanding. And again, I hope everyone will listen to that one later. But as for now, where did you want to start today to bring us into the next stage?
Well, I mean, last time I read the last chapter of the book, which is in some ways kind of a summary of it. And this time, because there's no need to rehash what we already went over unless that's inspired by questions. And so my thought was to read the first 4 chapters of the book, which are actually rather quick. These chapters are fairly short, but I try to keep them short and pointed to that end. And then potentially I have 2 other chapters which are perhaps more controversial that I'm also willing to share potentially if people desire. But I feel like reading the first couple of chapters is actually a good point into this to even kick off some debate because and discussion, since it after all is an introduction to a book on practical epistemology. So it would also serve as a good introduction to the second episode of this discussion.
That sounds great, Drewish. I'd love to listen. So anytime where you want to start, we'll have questions and answers after you finish your reading.
Yeah, no, I'll stop after each chapter just in case. I do want to preface that because of the nature of the book, I have many sources and to the side, sort of as addendums, explaining in further detail what I'm talking about, which I won't include in this reading because then it would make it not flow very well to give all my asides at every given point. But they're kind of positioned in such a way as to not get in the way of the main thrust of the arguments. So I will just read the text as is meant to be read, with those asides perhaps lingered upon if you want to know more for a later time. And I start every chapter with a quote that I feel is appropriate to the content. So the first chapter is Narratives as Starting Points. And the quote here is from Robert Stack, who you may know from Unsolved Mysteries. I don't mind UFOs and ghost stories. It's just that I tend to give value to the storyteller rather than to the story itself. We were all children once. We were all told that gravity pulls objects down well before learning that down is relative to our own planet. This is a simple, practical explanation that works for most people in their day-to-day lives. Similarly, Newtonian physics breaks down at a very large and very small scales, making it a simplification and abstraction as well, but it was good enough for the Apollo missions. The best simplified narratives convey an approximation of reality, which is often so useful that it allows people to live ignorant that it isn't the whole truth. Consider the flat earth theorists. How many people circumnavigate the globe or travel to space? How many people are involved in putting satellites into orbit or tracking global weather patterns? The vast majority of people don't really need to know if the earth is flat or not. And so there exists a group of people for whom the gravity makes things fall down explanation is not only sufficient, but which they assert as the truth. Does this bother you? Would you rather people agree on the nature of reality? Would you hope that the agreed upon view be true, or at least as true as current scientific advancement and societal knowledge allow? If so, you might be tempted to ask why even bother with the simplified things fall down story? Why not start with a more complex and full answer? Well, as I first said, we were all children once. We should also be honest about the limitations of people, both as children and often as adults as well. Calculus was invented in large part to derive and explain the laws of motion, but not everyone is capable of understanding it. If someone adheres to Jean Baptiste Lamarck's proposed intention-based vision for how evolution takes place, because the concepts of selective pressure and emergence are beyond them, is that more or less accurate than being a creationist? Talk to laypeople who claim to believe in the theory of evolution, and then ask them how it works. Many of them will either plead ignorance or give an explanation much closer to the ideas of Lamarck than Darwin. They believe in simplified narratives too, but unlike the creationist or flat earth theorist who knows that scientific institutions consider them ignorant, these "I believe in evolution even though I don't understand it" types are ignorant of their ignorance. The usefulness of these narratives as teaching mechanisms is not limited to people lacking the knowledge or mental capability to understand more nuanced and complex explanations. There's an exchange in A Study in Scarlet, the very first Sherlock Holmes story, where Watson is confounded to learn that Sherlock is unaware that the Earth revolves around the sun. To this, Sherlock replies, "What the deuce is it to me?" He interrupted impatiently. "You said that we go round the sun. If we went round the moon, it would not make a penny worth of difference to me or my work. The skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that that little room has elastic walls that can descend in any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts elbowing out the useful ones." There's an opportunity cost to trying to learn something, and that we have only so much energy and so much time. In spreading ourselves too thin, we might sacrifice the possibility of achieving real expertise and excellence in a domain for a general semi-competence. If your electrician believes in a flat earth, what difference does it make? What if they spent much of their time, which they used to learn their trade, instead becoming familiar with the history of astronomy and its discoveries? They might be more correct in understanding the planetary motion and gravity, but being a competent electrician is more important to them by far. You, dear reader, you picked up a book entitled Practical Epistemology, Finding Truth in the 21st Century. You may want the truth, or at least think that you do, but be forewarned. Most people want what is useful to them, be it true, a simplified narrative, or an outright lie. And deep down, that may be your default nature as well. It has been mine. The only problem is, once you really know and understand a truth, it becomes almost impossible to unlearn it. So perhaps we should not judge the imagined flat earth electrician, or those who believe in scientific theories that they do not and perhaps cannot understand. Then maybe we should similarly not judge ourselves either. The truth may not set us free. It may simply strain us with the burden of knowing. There is no shame in stopping here, putting on Jackson Browne's "Doctor My Eyes" and telling yourself that this book is nothing and has nothing to offer besides the rantings of a conspiracy-laden manifesto. Children seem happy enough, and we're all children once. That's the first chapter. I think before going further, I should open it up to anyone who has any kind of responses to the reason for its existence or the statements being made.
I think it's really well written, and I like the way that you have a sympathetic sort of approach towards people who are, unable to grapple with certain kinds of epistemological thinking, and why that then leads to agnosticism or alternative beliefs. So that was a nice entry point. It's not really a question; it's just an observation, like the chapter.
All right. I mean, I can keep going. I can go straight into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is entitled Citing My Censored Sources, and this is a Frederick Douglass quote. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Before moving on to the reasons why it might be a good idea to put forth the effort into finding the truth, I think I should address the odd manner in which I'll be citing my sources. You will notice that rather than a traditional bibliography with links to referenced articles or publications, I instead include images of related sources. To those who wish to simply click a link, this might seem frustrating, but this was done with reason and justification. In June of 2020, Avast, an antivirus application, started labeling archive.today as a phishing site. That followed actions earlier that year where web.archive.org, also known as the Wayback Machine, began removing and censoring archive pages. This made the site entirely useless as a means to verify the history of modified pages and publications for posterity, as it could be retroactively altered. Attempts at meaningful web sources that will not be changed or become dead links rest upon trusting that archival services will not be compromised, deplatformed, or otherwise made inaccessible. For this reason, I've instead chosen to provide contextual references, showing images of the primary documents or spoken of articles with enough keyword-related descriptions that the reader can know exactly what to search for when trying to find them. This method both respects the intelligence of the reader, you, and will hopefully allow a decentralized workaround to the creeping mass censorship that exists at the time I write this book. It also has the added benefit of presenting a kind of archival proof within the book itself that at one point these sources did exist, assuming of course that I am trustworthy, not fabricating these images. Also, while the quotes beginning each chapter are not confined to a particular place and time, I will occasionally dip into history for examples. This text largely centers on events in the United States from 2019 to 2021. I do this not because all of what is covered here applies only to that setting, but because grounding these thoughts and ideas to actual events both makes them easier to understand and clarifies the practical aspect of the title. If you are listening rather than reading, then simply imagine that all my claims are backed by very impressive citations, images, and graphs, just as I'm sure readers are imagining my words to be read in a powerful, commanding voice. This text is not some navel-gazing philosophy diatribe with no connection to the real world and no effective lessons to take from it. If you do not come away having learned something which can be applied to how you actually live, then I will have failed you. It's as much a self-help book and time capsule for a period of pervasive lies and deceits as it is a philosophy book. The powers that be can ban pages and users, censor search results, and even edit records of the past to rewrite history, but the internet remembers in the personal archives of users' hard drives. It is my hope that from these records our real history might be restored via torrents and obscure dark web repositories so that the truth may spread again. That's enough of that aside on my citations. Back to the topic at hand. If there are costs to seeking out or even just knowing the truth, why then should you bother? And that's the end of chapter 2. A very short chapter, but a necessary one. And of course, there are several images exemplifying these reasons that I am talking about laden within that chapter, and all of these chapters. But they don't do so well for being read aloud. That is meant for the actual readers of the book. I don't think there's probably too much to say about that chapter since it was so short and was pretty much just a clarification for the way in which the book is written. So I'll go on to chapter 3. The blissful danger of ignorance. This quote is from Ayn Rand. We can ignore reality, but we cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. In January of 2020, the World Health Organization seemed keenly interested in the spread and progression of a new coronavirus in China. The situation was also being followed by several communities and independent commentators on the internet. It wasn't yet clear if this disease would follow similar trajectories to SARS or many of the other recent pandemics that had often been played up by media outlets but fizzled out just as quickly. Everything seemed to be geared up for this to be the next be very afraid boogeyman virus that then sputtered out and is remembered more for the doomsday coverage than the actual disease itself. However, something very different was happening this time. Mainstream US media coverage, as well as organizations like the Center for Disease Control and World Health Organization, seemed to be downplaying the virus. When coverage did occur, it often seemed more focused on casting people concerned with the virus as being irrational bigots whose fear was either a manifestation of or triggered by xenophobic, anti-Chinese sentiments, where news outlets had loved the ratings bumps from potential and impending doom of viral outbreaks in the past. That was not the case this time. This caused a resounding consensus among those in the darker corners of the internet, a rare thing indeed. This was going to be the real deal. The talk of people overreacting and a collective sigh at doomsday preppers and irrational hysterics by bigots and conspiracy nuts continued until it didn't. As if on a dime, the message turned from "stop trying to create a panic" to 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Businesses closed. Rushes for mass toilet paper, bottled water, and non-perishable foods ensued. We were told 2 weeks, but even as I write these words, some 2 years later, hysteria over the new Omicron variant is prompting new restrictions in the states and regions where the lockdowns seem to be a hammer in search of a nail. In retrospect, the notion that it was ever going to be just 2 weeks seems laughable. The idea that the virus was a non-event, worth ignoring, even more so. Some claim that this was a deception, enabled and driven by Chinese influence in media companies and health organizations. Others blame the hyper-partisan election year coverage, with the pandemic hitting during an impeachment trial, for catching us flat-footed. Still others say that the minimization or outright misinformation was necessary to avoid a panic, or for the greater good. See the following quote regarding why citizens were told initially that masks were ineffective, or could even make things worse. And this is from Dr. Anthony Fauci. It was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply, and we wanted to make sure that masks were available for the people, namely healthcare workers who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected. The more cynically minded, of course, thought those in power simply didn't want the general populace knowing, at least until they could prepare first. Regardless of the cause, however, if you got your information from traditional media and official agencies, you were caught off guard when the switch was flipped in March of 2020, and everyone was told to stay inside lest they risk exposure. Suddenly shortages hit, first for medicine and paper products driven by panic buying, then for other things as supply chains were strained and mass layoffs and recession took hold. For myself, I had a job offer in the beginning of February of 2020. There were plenty of things to consider regarding whether I should take the offer or stay with the full-time programming gig I already had. One thing that struck me, though, was that this new job was a 6-month contract to hire position, and if, as I suspected, given the information I was getting regarding the coronavirus, the economy tanked, it would be a bad time to be in an at-will contract position. Now, I may still not have taken the offer, but that thought made the decision all that much easier. Upon realizing that I was legitimately worried about the then potential pandemic, enough to take it into account for such an important decision, I stocked up on non-perishable food, water, filters, paper products, ammo, and secured cleaning and personal protective products, masks, gloves, etc. I did this nearly a month prior to the toilet paper shortages and panic buying that gripped the United States. Not because I had any special connections, but because the sources I gathered my news from gave me a more accurate picture of reality than did those consumed by most other Americans. There's a power in knowing the truth. It allows you to make better decisions. In the same way that radar gave the Allies a distinct advantage in naval combat during World War II, if you want to make the smartest move, it helps to know where the pieces are on the board. This is so intuitively true that it almost seems absurd to need to state it. I was concerned while others went about their lives peacefully. Hell, I even got some strange looks when I attempted to tell some coworkers that they should stock up. But vindication is not the reward of knowledge. Despite the momentary discomfort, existential dread, or painful disenchantment that sometimes follows learning harsh truths, the wisdom gained from these hard lessons is worth the price. If given the option to either become as ignorant, innocent, and naive as children, or remain in your current age, or to pass along the hard-fought life lessons to a younger version of yourself, which would you take? Most, I believe, would take the latter. So perhaps I've convinced you, or maybe you came already convinced of the practical value of the truth. You might be thinking to yourself, all right, the truth is potentially useful, but this book is supposed to be about practical epistemology. That's how we find and know what is true. Where are the chapters on that? And that's fair enough. We'll put aside the practical element for now and tackle that all-important question, how do you know if something is true? And that's the end of chapter 3. I will take a water break, but if anyone has any questions or comments before selecting another
say it's
topic.
a real pleasure to listen to. Very well written and well read, and I'd love to listen to you read more of it anytime. It's really enjoyable. So just thank you for that.
That was excellent.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Dude,
both.
I think you got it going on or whatever, dude. So just do that.
All right.
Yeah.
So my intention is to read the next chapter and then potentially go into one of the more controversial chapters after that, sort of jump ahead to something which will be probably inspire more debate and discussion. Because I don't want to give away everything. I think the first 4 chapters is a sufficient introduction, if you will.
Great. Well, as much as you're willing to share, we appreciate the sneak peek on your upcoming book. Very enjoyable to listen to.
The 4th chapter is entitled A Standard for Understanding, and it has 2 quotes. The first is, "The best way to predict the future is to create it," by Abraham Lincoln. And the second quote is, "Every quote on the internet is fake," also Abraham Lincoln. In ages past, people employed oracles and soothsayers, with many variations of the same question on their lips. What does the future hold? Well, to be honest, many still do this, but as individuals with things like psychic hotlines, and as a society with macroeconomic models. The promise of future knowledge, of knowing the outcome before it happens, is a dream so enticing that it keeps everyone coming back to these fortune tellers no matter how many times they get it wrong. If you knew a psychic who gave you the winning lotto numbers every time, then you'd be a regular customer. Of course, you might ask why they aren't playing the lotto themselves. In a similar vein, various schools of economics simply adjust their models to give reasonable sounding explanations for what has already happened. But what if its practitioners could instead accurately tell you what was about to happen? Well, then you'd be a fool not to use such marvelous advice to your advantage. In a more realistic example, imagine that you're broken down on the side of the road. Thankfully, your friend, a mechanic with several years of experience, has come to help you. He says you just need a jump, hands you the cables, and pops his hood before going to have a cigarette. You attach the cables to your car battery, and then go to do the same on his end. But then you see him running towards you, shouting, "Stop! Not like that!" Now, you might stop and ask why. You might simply take his word for it, and hold perfectly still until given instructions. But if instead you shout, "You can't tell me what to do," and go ahead with it, well, then you'll learn something. Either your friend doesn't know as much as he thinks he does, or you're going to soon know what he already does, but the hard way. Now imagine a driver is going down a straight highway that they've never been on before. There's almost no traffic, and the speedometer reads 70 miles an hour. The destination is just off an exit that is 70 miles away. Then a passenger asks, how much longer until we're there? With confidence, the driver lets them know it will be about an hour. In the 2 situations above, a prediction about the future was made. The mechanic's experience conferred an understanding of the car's system. A basic understanding of how velocity works, distance traveled equals time times speed, gave the driver the ability to estimate the remaining time they would be on the road. Being able to make accurate predictions is, generally speaking, the proof of understanding. If you can predict well enough what is going to happen before it does, then congratulations, you know something. All of empiricism, the approach of testing hypotheses that underlies the scientific method, is based on this notion. A replication study is one where you take an experiment that has already been run and do it again. If the experiment's methodology is sound, then you should get the same results. Predicting the future isn't just the reward for knowing the truth, it's the standard by which you measure it as well. Now there's plenty of gray area here, namely the gray sciences. There's a big difference between having a reproducible correlation and explicitly stated and understood causation. A correlation is where you can predict the results when a certain set of criteria are met with some accuracy. Causation is where the mechanisms are known so that they can be applied to situations very much unlike the experiment that exposed them. It's the difference between most car accidents occur within 25 miles of your home and the majority of driving is done within 25 miles of your home, which is why that's where most car accidents occur. The power of causal knowledge is that it allows you to incorporate new data without having to run new experiments. In the example of the driver estimating an hour left for their trip, if they know that the speed limit is going to change 10 miles before the exit, then they can do the math and update their prediction. There are medications where the mechanisms are not entirely understood. In clinical tests, they will have a desired impact, though the means by which they do this, well, that's not fully understood. However, if they take another medication or eat a certain food, then the effects of the same dosage might be drastically changed, or new previously absent side effects emerge. Because the mechanisms for how and why these interactions occur is not known, the only way to identify them is with new experiments specifically to measure them. This is practical distinction. The practical distinction between something that is known only via correlation. I'm sorry, I'm going to correct this typo. I got tripped up by a typo I did not realize until this moment. This is the practical distinction between something that is known only via correlation. You can make accurate predictions, but only in confined situations. There are limitations regarding causal knowledge as well. Think back to our driver going at 70 miles an hour, that example. Suppose that a new traffic jam is forming 20 miles ahead of where the driver currently is. Suddenly, their simple math equations don't really apply anymore. The world is messy. And even if you have an accurate model for how something functions, it exists in a world where it can be influenced by other things. Causal models are great when you can control for unknowns, but good luck avoiding unknowns in the real world. The narrower scope of correlation-based knowledge means that it will only be useful for more restrictive and limited models. This isn't necessarily weakness, though. This potentially has a side benefit of not giving the practitioner the unrealistic belief that they truly understand everything. Remember, George E.P. Bach said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." Regardless of how you got there, though, the standard is the same. Do you know what's going to happen? Anyone can claim to be good at blackjack. But if you've really been counting cards and know what the right move is, prove it. Put your money where your mouth is and show us. That's the end of that chapter. Okay. Ooh, I should drink more water before I do a reading session. I'm sorry. But I think at this point you kind of get a sense for the way in which the book is written, how it presents its case, and how it slowly builds upon itself layer by layer onto the next thing, in small encapsulated chapters. That's my goal. Any criticism, of course, I will take. I do want to give an opportunity for people to share some things or talk about things before we select one of the more controversial chapters to read, which I know will prompt discussion.
So am I correct that the goal is sort of to guide people through good thinking skills and good skills for interpreting information chapter by chapter, so that, you know, the average casual person will kind of have some more of a high level skill set in terms of how to understand things? Like that's sort of the overarching goal.
The goal is to give basically simplified heuristics about what you, how you arrive at truth, and in whom you should place your trust, and so on and so forth. But even though the results are simplified rules and heuristics, I want to give the full explanation as to how I reach those conclusions as well. So it's not just, hey, follow these 10 rules. It's, hey, here's why these rules make sense. And I'm building to those rules, which will be interspersed within the chapter. There's like 6 of them. Because it's important to understand why those rules are or should be followed, if that makes sense. So it's really like a self-help practical book, but focused on epistemology as the thing to help people with. So yes, what you said is pretty accurate. Just minor caveats. Yeah.
I know for myself, whenever I'm making a decision, I want to try to make the best decision possible. And I think that's probably a very common thing. And I found that while I was listening, I wanted to hear more or read more, let's say, simply because of the fact that I'm always trying to improve on my decision-making skills, right? And yeah, it's been very interesting. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, if people want a bit of I guess controversy here, we can jump to perhaps what I think will be the most controversial chapter in this book. Science is not self-correcting. There will be this chapter does refer back, or it doesn't explain everything that it's saying, because it refers back to some points that are made earlier on in the book that are in the chapters which are being skipped to jump to this one. But it can still be understood on its own. So if everyone is open to it, I will read that chapter, and then I am sure that discussion, if not debate, will occur. All right. This is from Science is Not Self-Correcting. The opening quote is from Max Planck. Science advances one funeral at a time. In 1633, Father Vincenzo Maculano, I may have butchered that, acted as chief inquisitor, having been appointed by Pope Urban VIII in the case against Galileo Galilei. Galileo was on trial for his heretical proclamations that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the other way around. In 1992, over 300 years later, the Catholic Church apologized to the long since dead Galileo. Is this clear evidence that the Catholic Church is self-correcting? No, of course not. When people proclaim that science is self-correcting, they are not asserting that, given centuries and external pressures, eventually scientific institutions will admit their errors. They are claiming that the internal workings of scientific societies, associations, and academies will be responsible for this change in direction. Additionally, they are claiming that this correction can and will occur because scientists, when presented with new evidence, will introspect, reflect, and be willing to change their minds. No external pressure should be required. In fact, the fewer external forces influencing scientific institutions, the better. This is the claim made when people state that science is self-correcting. If true, we should expect scientific institutions to be largely immune to the passions of the day. There might be an ongoing bias towards pre-existing assumptions, but it should be short-lived. Shortly after new evidence is found and verified which falsifies existing narratives, that should change. The data itself ought to cause scientists to change their minds, the established views to be overturned, and the truth, as presently known and taught, to be updated to reflect this new information. However, if government grants and for-profit research enable political ideology and business interests to exert influence over science, that could cause issues. If competition for prestige and publication requirements incentivize researchers to play fast and loose with experimental methodology, that too might be a problem. If there is then simultaneously scant incentive to do replication studies or publish negative results, leading to exaggerated or fabricated results to go unchallenged, then these problems would be even worse. And if numerous academics and researchers are driven by ego and prestige, essentially not upholding objectivity to any higher degree than countless other fields or professions, well, then the entire claim that science is self-correcting would be simply untrue. Academics are, by their own estimation, the current standard bearers of science. But what if the academy has become, or perhaps always was, a secretive institution more concerned with its own self-preservation than discovering and preserving knowledge? Would it then be likely to change due to external pressures demanding it to do so? Hold on, I have a typo here. Would it then be likely to change due to external pressures demanding it do so, instead of via honest internal review of its own orthodoxy? What if science is self-correcting, is in fact just a slogan thrown out in order to explain away the numerous errors in the predictions and positions made and taken by scientific institutions and authorities? Imagine the scenario. You were mistaken, but your first impulse was to deny it, ridiculing those who disagreed with you. Later, when forced to confront your mistake, you do so by claiming that finding the error was part of your process and plan all along. Afterwards, you proclaim, "I am so humble that I can admit my errors. More people should be like me. How wonderful of you to be so self-correcting." It's far worse than that, though. Imagine that policies which impact innumerable people were enacted based on your mistake. Imagine that you are heralded as the purveyor of truth, and that teaching reverence to your decrees is part of mandatory education policies. What incentives would you have to ever self-correct? At least when the Catholic Church apologized to Galileo, they didn't have the gall to claim that Galileo's insight was a miraculous gift from God. Academia now has the appearance of a temple, filled with followers wearing religiously themed robes they've knit together from skin peeled off science's back. Perhaps this was not always the case. Likely the nature and extent of the corruption will have waxed and waned over time. It's clear, however, that mistrust in scientific institutions is now on the rise. The general explanation here is to blame the people, who must be rejecting science because it does not conform to their worldview. The cases presented here would indicate that perhaps it's the other way around. Either way, what happened? What has either caused so many people to turn away from expertise or changed in the nature of scientific institutions to make them more corrupt and less scientific? The harsh and bitter truth is that science was always more of an institution than a process. The entire notion of peer review requires that there be a subset of peers to do so. There's nothing stopping individuals from performing experiments and then sharing both step-by-step instructions on what they did along the way and the results. There's nothing to keep an individual from publishing a book dedicated to expressing or sharing knowledge. And new, useful math calculations, chemical compounds, and practical inventions are found in industry by engineers simply tinkering with no academic oversight. Science isn't always open. Just see how long the Freedom of Information Act request will take to get the FDA's information on COVID vaccine data. Science isn't always predictive. Otherwise, there wouldn't be competing schools of macroeconomics, none of which can reliably predict the future. The very question of what does and doesn't qualify as science, otherwise known as the demarcation problem, has been sidestepped by academic departments, more concerned with securing funding than humoring questions regarding their own validity. But rest assured, when a policymaker has a plan in mind, someone with scientific credentials will be found to promote it, claiming that the evidence and science support taking such an approach. With COVID policy in particular, the public is being told that they are not allowed to see the data, so they cannot make rational cost-benefit analyses for themselves, which is fine because discussion regarding anything oppositional to the official narrative faces censorship, so it's not like the public was ever meant to be able to discuss or think for themselves on this issue anyways. then mandates and state-based coercion are being deployed to force compliance. This, unsurprisingly, has caused quite a backlash against institutional science itself. Occasionally, a person will come forward, agreeing with all the institutional claims, but regretting this failure in communication that has seeded so much distrust. They worry that as a result, many people will distrust science, which will lead to far greater devastation during the next pandemic. If science were what it claimed to be, it would welcome questioning. This is apologism, verging on what Catholic parishioners told sex abuse victims to keep quiet, to maintain the church's reputation because that was the greater good. And of course, if that didn't work, the higher-ups be more forceful with veiled threats. What has happened with COVID is no failure of communication. Apologists will always point to the failures of science as the exceptions, no matter how many times they occur. Otherwise, they will fall back on science is self-correcting as a means of reframing them as the process working as intended. None of the fundamental aspects of empiricism, logic, or open debate intrinsic to discovery require that there be scientific halls of power to uphold them. These academics claim the mantle of science as the personal cloak and use it precisely so that they don't have to prove things to you, but can instead speak with unquestionable authority. And here's another quote. All I want to do is save people's lives. And I mean, anyone who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science because nobody's going to know what they're talking about, but if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people can recognize there's a person there. So it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. Anthony Fauci. If science is just a code word for the academy, then it is just doing what institutional power always does. Science is less a candle in the dark and more a picture of a candle claiming to be a source of light. End of chapter.
That last line was very powerful. The whole chapter, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good metaphor at the end of the photo of the candle. I like that.
All right, I think I'm not going to read any more from the book for a bit because let's bring this back to more of a interview podcast discussion, please, because I feel my voice needs a little bit of a break.
That's fine, but again, we really appreciate you reading to us from your new book, and certainly I'll look forward to buying it and reading it in full when it comes out. And certainly we'll advertise it as much as we can on the server. But I mean, I don't really have any questions per se. Like Kasheka said, it's well articulated, and maybe someone else has a question or a comment though for Drewish.
Oh wow, that's your book you're reading from? You wrote?
I'm in the process of writing it. So
Oh.
I've been reading chapters from the book I'm writing. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's really I like that. The way you said, the candle, claiming to be the candle or the source of light. And science is an institution just like religion is too. I mean, they have their little back door of secrets, and like NASA. I mean, NASA is not really telling nothing, and then this survey of the data about what's going on with the COVID shot. I mean, they're trying to cover that up too because they got some, a lot of bad stuff going on in that too. And but I do scientific research. I found out about this blue dust. I think that's very interesting, and I don't know if I just got to go to the science, physics department, and write a letter about, some things I found out. But just like Galileo, a lot of these people are gonna, you get attacked when you get, find new stuff out. You get criticism.
Mhm. So, if if it's okay with you, your question or your comment rather, kind of gave me an idea for a question, and I don't think you asked like a specific question. So, if I can just build off what you said, Drewish, COVID, like OpenEye said's a big thing now, and you mentioned it, right? But can you maybe tell us what are some of the biggest epistemological errors that you think that people are making when they think about this COVID issue right now? Like whether you're talking the authorities or just the mainstream day-to-day people, like what do you think are the epistemological errors that people are making when they're thinking about COVID today, day to day?
Well, I mean, I understand the motivation behind trying to downplay any possible costs and upplay any possible benefits for general public health. But for example, there's a study, I can go find it and post it if you like. Myocarditis, I have trouble pronouncing this word, I always do. The inflammation of the heart, which is sometimes a result of, vaccination as well as COVID itself. Some studies were done, and they broke it down by sex and age. And if you are a man under 40, based on, this is one study, you are about 3 times more likely to develop this inflammation of the heart from the second shot of the Moderna vaccine than you are an actual COVID infection. And let's say you're already dead set, you're going to get vaccinated, okay? And you're just trying to make a determination about which vaccine you should get. That's some pretty handy information to have. Like, oh, I'm going to avoid this one. I'm going to get the Pfizer one instead if you're a man under 40. Like there's one of the biggest issues is that people want real information, so they, a huge thing when it comes to medicine and medical treatment is informed consent, okay? And both the informed aspect and the consent aspect are being undermined simultaneously. And I mean, I guess the consent portion is more a moral, ethical issue, but the informed part, that's an epistemological one. And one of the rules that I have, and this is probably one of the most simplified, easy rules, is when someone insists that you are not allowed to ask questions, that's the surest sign that you should default to not believing them. I have a chapter called the Contrarian Null Hypothesis, which deals with this explicitly. Not to say that, there will be bad actors and idiots behind every vantage and viewpoint that is controversial, for sure, on both sides or on all sides. That's just going to happen. You don't want to judge ideas based upon their weakest advocates. But if someone is using institutional power to compel you to agree with something, if there's any time to not go with the flow and to really think before you act, that's it right there. Take note. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. And I could follow up, but thank you. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Drewish? Drewish, I mean, you're more advanced in this area of study, and the average person maybe isn't even aware of what epistemology is, right? So what would you say is like the number one starting like applied epistemological thing that a normal person could try and do to change their life, right? Just a everyday Joe Sixpack kind of person. Like how could they think about starting to apply epistemology like consciously if they've never even thought about it before?
I mean, all right, so I'm going to remove myself from the book, because in the book I'm trying to lay out like someone who's deeply engaged and thoughtful and trying to proactively build better patterns and heuristics for being better about learning and the truth. So I'm taking somebody who's like, give me a sentence or two, I don't want to listen to anything else, and you're just going to try and help me, even though this is a simplified lesson that really doesn't apply to most people necessarily, but would apply to that kind of a person. I would say that the news isn't there to inform you. The news is the distraction to prevent you from getting at the real information. That would be the simplest, clearest, easiest heuristic I would give to Joe Schmo that would help him in maybe finding the truth a bit more in his life. Because nothing inspires people to want to look more deeply into the truth when they realize that they weren't being told something intentionally. Because that tells them, oh, I need to pay attention if I really want to know something. So yeah, I'm not saying that is the best rule, or even that rule doesn't have plenty of exceptions. But if that's the only rule I'm willing to give, I'm able to give a person, I'll go with that one.
Well,
So,
I want to ask you a question. We got all this fake news and politics and fake religion. I mean, a lot of people like false prophets, like David Wilcock. They got a couple people, Corey Good, and they're just doing a lot of this for money. I mean, a lot of people know they're fake, but some people are fooled, because they're actually paying them money for their little bullshit they're doing. Uh, I don't know if you know, do you ever think this shit's ever gonna stop, like fake news, or are we just gonna stand up and just say, no, no more. We tired of y'all fucking fake news. What's gonna happen? What do we have to do, to stop this? I'm kind of asking the question about, this stuff. And, so what you think?
There are two chapters in the book. One deals with trusting individuals over institutions, and the other is the vestigial becomes a cancer. And they both touch upon this notion that over time, any institution that it's like this institution exists to teach kids, and then before long, that's not what this institution's about. This is an institution about paying for textbooks, or like there is a nature to a beast where when you have something which is there to continuously serve something, where there's no goal by which it ends, but it's just meant to continuously exist, entropy will take hold. It will decay. It will corrupt. Individuals can't always be trusted, for sure. There are plenty of idiots and liars. People are just full of shit out there, tons. But an individual, at least potentially, can be trusted. Well, an institution is just somebody trying to have a legacy, not realizing that what they're going to leave behind with an institution is nothing like what they could do as an individual. That's another one of the rules I put out here. Don't trust institutions. Find individuals you can trust instead. And there's no reason to do that in the day and age of the internet with distributed information. And so if you think fake news is ever going to go away, no, because here's the thing. Once an individual or an institution gains a reputation, people start following them, people like them, people believe them, then there's an incentive. The easiest one is marketing. Well, it's like, yeah, while you're talking to people and they're listening to you, how about you tell about how awesome these headphones are? Or how about and that's a softer thing, because at least people kind of know when it's like, oh, and this is an ad, blah, blah, blah. Don't give it too much weight, so on and so forth. But then there's ads that aren't clearly necessarily ads. And then there's people who might change their messaging entirely for certain amounts of money. And then there are people who might simply be pretty faces reading words, actors on the screen, news anchors, and their whole point is to say what words are put in front of them, and they don't have any opinions or integrity themselves that can ever be displayed, because their whole point is not to. So always expect that good reputations will be cashed in at some point from institutions. With individuals too, plenty of people sell out, but at least a person has the potential not to. A person or a privately held company, which is really just a proxy for its owner, can. But when there's an organization, an institution, a publicly traded company that is chasing that bottom line, there's no chance for integrity or morality to get in the way of basically selling out. So I would always expect You can get rid of, disinformation is just as impossible to get rid of as real information is. You can't stop either one. They're always going to be out there, and what you can trust from one moment might change to another moment, and there can be rules to help you with that. But even trustworthy individuals, sometimes they get crazy and decline, or they can say things where they're completely out of their element and just become a little bit too arrogant because their ego's been inflated by fame. I have another chapter on that. So you just got to constant vigilance. There's no way around it. I'm sorry. If there were a shortcut to that, it would be great, but there isn't.
Well, I think we need to make an institution like a watchdog institution, because you got the feds, with the banking system, about the bank, it's a bunch of fraud, the corporation with the feds and the banking and all that. And then you got the science, you got NASA, and the bad thing is that we got some new actors that's coming in. We got Facebook, we got Twitter, they're doing a lot of fake news or trying to, manipulate our civil rights, from free speech and stuff. I mean, there's so many bad guys that's coming into the fold. I mean, we're going to have to create something, like some organization to just, fight against that or something.
Why do you need an organization? Like, what's the difference between this big production to organize a professional-looking studio where you have people talking in front of a camera, or someone opening a webcam and talking into their camera? Distribution and the means of recording things and conveying information, that has been democratized to such an extent. It's like the whole point of Twitter early on, the thing which made it, it's like there's an earthquake over here and people are taking photos and videos of it going on, and it's spreading, so the people who will get impacted by it later find out about it via tweet before the earth starts moving. That's the level of ease of communication that can occur in the age of the internet. We can spread information quickly. It does not take hardly anything for an individual to express ideas or their analysis or any of that kind of thing. Distribution is the easy part of this. So why develop a corruptible organization? Much easier to kill an organization, much easier to fight an organization, but decentralized, thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of people, just spreading ideas organically through various channels, all of which can be monitored, let alone censored. That's the brilliance in the age of technology that we live in. If there's anything glorious about living in the internet age, that's it right there.
Beautiful stuff. Thank you, Drewish. Thank you for your questions, Open Eye. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Drewish while we have him here? I have one if people want to think about what they might ask before the next chance. What do you think is the biggest sort of epistemological trick that is being played on people? In other words, what's an epistemological weakness that is being used to lead people to the wrong conclusions, right? So, on the flip side, the last question I asked was, what's a good epistemological habit someone could have? But on the flip side, what's something they should look out for that people are trying to sort of confuse their epistemology?
Self-deprecation and false humility have been weaponized. This notion that, well, you can trust him to be honest because he's making fun of himself, kind of thing. I mean, imagine how easy it is to get a token individual to represent an idea and then express them as the representative for a group of people, or you know what I'm saying? I mean, let's take we'll take and I don't mean to make this overtly political, but let's take The View right now. They're having a lot of difficulty replacing Meghan McCain for their panel. They want somebody who is ostensibly a Republican to fill out their roster so they can have one, right winger on there. But nobody's taking the job because they have a bunch of rules regarding, well, you're a right winger, but you have to have this view and this view and this view to be acceptable here. And that eliminates a huge number of people. And then no one wants to just sign up to be the fake conservative on a show which is largely about just trashing them. I mean, I don't mean to say that this is I'm just bringing this up as an example. There's this notion that there are people who their whole job is to let themselves lose, let themselves pretend to be an advocate for position or pretend to be humble when in actuality it's all an act. And I think for a while, because in your personal conversation with somebody, there's a big difference between parasocial relationships being one way, where you see the person on the screen, you listen to them and you know a lot of stuff about them. They don't know you from Adam because you're just somebody who listens. It's a one-way communication situation. And when something is on the television and it's staged and they're actors like that, the rules are completely different than in-person conversation. If an individual is willing to have a debate with you and then partway through to be able to say, you know what? You might be right about this. I may be wrong. I have to think about this more. I mean, that's a sign of somebody who's taking you seriously. They're actively trying to have a real conversation and not just trying to push a view, but potentially learn. Man, that is amazing. But when you see that happen on TV, it is almost always scripted. It is almost always there's a setup to make you think, well, the other side won because this side admitted it. And so it's very important not to conflate the two and to understand the difference between what's on that screen and what is real and what you can have feedback in, what's real time, what is an actual back and forth conversation between you and somebody else or other people. Hopefully, I gave you something there.
Definitely, yes. Thank you. So we're going to give the audience one more chance if anyone wants to ask a question or give a comment to Mr. Drewish before we begin closing up the podcast. Okay. Well, again, I really enjoyed listening to your readings.
It looks like Squad is asking if he can ask a question via text.
Yeah, if you want to post it, I can read it for you, but just if you want to post it in general. Quickly.
I'd like to thank you for giving us so much to think about as well.
Absolutely. And again, if you all just post it now for anyone who is interested, I highly recommend you go back and listen to the first episode with Drewish, which is right here. Squad will give you just a few seconds to type up your question if you want. Yeah, Drewish, anytime you want to come back on and do another one, now we have 2. So whenever you get 2, my OCD kicks in and I want to make a trilogy. So we should bookmark the 3rd episode for whenever you're ready.
We should, we'll do a 3rd when the book is ready for publication, when it's like in that final editing form. And yeah. And they'll perhaps share some more chapters, but I feel like you got quite a bit of a teaser here, so
100%. And Squad can ask his question next time. That's fine. But as for yourself, I'd just like to ask: is there any sort of closing points or takeaways that you'd like to leave the audience with? A final note for people in the audience, live and on BitChute, to reflect on, and on YouTube. Oh
no, I think they've been given enough to chew on in this. Hopefully, if not. I mean, if you don't think so, if this didn't spark your imagination at all, don't bother with the book. Don't.
Right. I'm looking forward to the book. I highly recommend everyone listen to episode 1 in general chat. And thank you so much, Drewish, for coming on, for your time. And thank you to the audience for attending and for your questions and participation. Much appreciated, everybody. Thank you, Drewish. And keep an eye out for the book, Practical Epistemology, Finding Truth in the 21st Century by our very own Drewish. Very much looking forward to that. It's going to be awesome. Thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and jump up to roundtable.
Squad, I see your question in text. I will answer it in text.
Yeah,
okay.
you can answer later. But that'll conclude the podcast. So if everyone wants to jump up to the pub or to roundtable, I'll see you guys up there. Thanks again. And thanks to Rafi for recording. Join the Roundtable Discord server. Check announcements for upcoming events. Like, follow, and subscribe to all our hashtag RT podcasts in the podcast channel.